Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the 9th episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Gecko had been having quite a bad week so far. Her commander had been kidnapped. His replacement seemed to think she was some kind of indentured tea lady instead of a jonin, and she had looked up her symptoms in the medical encyclopedia and she definitely had mountain syndrome and about 2 weeks left to live if her self-diagnosis was correct. It was not with pleasure that she was called forth to report yet another failure to all the higher UPS who'd arrived at their small outpost looking for answers and accountability. The search and rescue squads couldn't trace their missing commander, and every day that passed was making the dead trail even colder. It was as the new commander was turning to her, no doubt to ask her to fetch everyone another round of tea, when something extraordinarily heavy landed in her lap and her vision filled with blonde. "Sorry." Minato called apologetically when she careened across the room, wheezing as she rummaged through her pockets for her inhaler. A circle of astonished faces stared at him, and looking around he realized he'd appeared in his own cabin in the middle of some kind of meeting. His desk had been swept clean and turned into a conference table, and besides Gecko and Yuhi he counted his substitute, 3 ANBU captains minus their masks and 1 Hatake Tsukumo sitting beside his very own sensei, the latter of whom appeared more amused than astonished. Judging by all the papers on the desk, they were very engrossed in search and rescue plans. "A little help, please," he said, motioning his bound hands at them. Tsukumo was the first to get over his surprise and stood up. "Cut him loose." Yuhi drew a kunai and carefully severed the straps cutting into Minato's wrists, but even when they fell away and the raw welts beneath were laid bare he had trouble extending his fingers. Pain shot through every bone and tendon like fire. One of the ANBU captains of the medical division came forward and immediately began to ease the wounds with his cooling chakra. Another of the ANBU captains rose from her seat beside Tsukumo. "How good of you to join us," she said, perplexed. "We were just discussing you. Organizing a party to celebrate, commiserate your disappearance," said Jiraiya with a devious twinkle in his eyes. "Sorry to spoil your plans," Minato responded. Tsukumo interrupted them impatiently. "Your report?" "I was being held in a Kumo base about 12 miles away to the northeast of here. Initially they were attempting to exchange me for Uzumaki Kushina, though when that failed they attempted to interrogate me." "Yes, we got the strange ransom note," said Jiraiya, relaxing back in his chair. "The Hokage didn't think the terms were very agreeable. Sorry about that. I told him not to worry, I had every faith you'd fight your way out eventually." "What rubbish," the ANBU captain exploded at him. "You've been running around like a headless chicken all week. When you weren't shouting at the new recruits and reducing them to tears you were off sobbing in a corner yourself." "Libel," declared Jiraiya furiously, springing upright again. Tsukumo's sharp tone cut through the room once more. "That aside, Minato, your return is a great relief and we can talk about this more tomorrow after you've rested and recuperated. Right now it is our job to mobilize a force quickly and move in on this base. Even though Kumo no doubt sanctioned this, they've officially dissociated themselves with the ones responsible, which means we can deal with them as we wish. Kumo needs to be shown what happens when they kidnap our people and try to extort us. Kumo's planning an invasion soon," Minato told him. "They won't be keeping up the peaceful pretense for much longer." "How do you know this?" asked the ANBU captain. "My captor was a very senior member of Kumo's intelligence section and a little too forthcoming when he thought I had no chance of escape. But since I'd given Gecko one of my kunai, I was able to leave at any time. I stuck around as long as I could to learn the reasons for wanting to abduct me and Kumo's plans in general." When the medical captain stepped away from him, Minato paused to look down at his hands, still badly marked and stinging, but at least he could flex his fingers fully. "Oh, thank you, that's much better. Anyway, I only really returned so someone could cut me free. I'm not quite done with that base yet, so if you'll excuse me. He turned and went to the small closet where most of his gear had lain untouched in his absence. A new belt would be required. Smoke bombs, explosive tags, contract scrolls, a couple of kunai. He tested their sharpness on his already tattered sleeve and nodded in satisfaction when they sliced the fabric like it was soft butter. Behind him he heard the scrape of a chair as Jiraiya rose to his feet. "Leave this one to us, Minato," he said. "You've done enough. By the time you organize a force big enough to take the base and march it up the mountain, they'll have packed up and gone. We have only a few minutes at most." Minato slipped on a pair of gloves to protect his damaged hands and then paused, looking around the room for that one final thing he'd forgotten, but he knew he needed more than anything. He spotted the plate of half-eaten biscuits in the middle of the desk. Ah! He went over and stuffed most of them in his mouth in one go. After a week of the bare minimum, he was unbelievably hungry. The biscuits would have to do for now until he could get home and park himself before an all-you-can-eat buffet for a few days. Or he could just park himself in front of Kushina and give her the puppy eyes. "We should discuss this plan," said the ANBU captain urgently, which was typical of her profession. If a fire broke out in the ANBU headquarters, the captains would probably call a conference to decide what to do about it. "This has been the plan for the best part of the week," Minato told her. "Please. Do not concern yourselves." "Minato," Jiraiya sighed helplessly. Swiping the last of the biscuits, he turned to Gecko. "If you could keep minding that for me just a little bit longer," he said, pointing to the marked kunai dangling from her belt. "I promise I'll aim myself a little more carefully next time." "Sure thing, Taicho," she said faintly. To the others he nodded one last time. "I'll be back shortly." Before they could raise another protest, he activated Hiration and stepped from the cozy warmth of his crowded cabin back into his dark, cold cell where the air was noticeably thinner. The chakra mark that he'd previously planted against the wall with his foot faded and he looked towards the door that had been left open invitingly wide. He swept through it and into the veins of the base. The empty corridors were narrow and quiet, and every couple of yards Minato ran his hand along the wall like a blind man feeling his way. It was an apt comparison since his probing chakra told him more about the structure of the base than his eyes could. Beyond these thick walls was pure rock and little else. The complex was a small one, more of a bolt hole than a base, constructed within a mountain and was most likely invisible from the outside. An expedition from the Konoha outpost would hike right past it if they didn't know what they were looking for. Static interference suddenly crackled through the hollow corridors. Minato was treated to the very unpleasant experience of hearing Kusunagi's disembodied voice screech through the base's intercom system. "Where is G and Akino? We're leaving in 5, if you haven't collected the transferals by then I'm leaving you behind and blowing the base with you in it." If everyone was on a first-name terms, there could only have been a handful of people occupying the base, which made sense given its small size. He'd made the right decision, he thought, raising a biscuit to his mouth to snap it in half. A clatter of boots echoed down the corridor ahead of him. Evidently someone didn't want to get blown up. When the first Kyumo-nin ran around the corner and saw Minato, he braked so hard his companion ran into him from behind. "Slack-jawed," he pointed. "It's him. He's right there." Minato took 2 deft steps and grabbed the pointing hand, slamming its owner into the wall and twisting his arm high behind his back until he gave a distinctive whimper. The second Kyumo-nin didn't hang back, and with one hand employed in restraining the first man and the other holding half a biscuit, there wasn't much he could do about it. He dodged the first punch. The second he deflected with his elbow. Before the increasingly desperate man could aim a third strike, Minato's foot lashed up, catching him in the stomach. A spluttering grunt bounced off the walls, followed by a sound thud as Minato hooked the toes of his sandal behind the man's heel and swept his feet out. Now with one man on the ground held in place by a foot against His throat and another pinned to the wall, Minato helped himself to the second half of his biscuit. Where's Kusunagi's quarters, or wherever else is the center of operations here? Neither man spoke. The one on the ground tried to reach for a kunai but quite wisely stopped, and Minato started to shift more of his weight onto the foot, compressing his windpipe. It's in your interests to talk to me, he warned them. Either way, I'm leaving you both unconscious, and if I don't find your boss before he blows up this base, you'll both be charred corpses tomorrow. Round the corner, the way we came, said the man on the floor ever so quickly. Up the stairs and then follow the corridor straight. It's the very end room, you can't miss it. Gee, growled the man up against the wall, and began to struggle. Minato looked at him sharply. Don't move. Perhaps he thought Minato was bluffing or that he wasn't being restrained so tightly. He continued to resist and tried to jerk his arm free of the lock, and in a small cascade of pops and snaps his elbow and shoulder shattered. His arm simply fell apart. Minato smothered his scream with his hand and quickly pushed the writhing man to the ground. He reached for their throats, probing a thumb behind their carotid artery to press and massage the hidden pulse point that caused paralysis and hastened unconsciousness. True to his word, he would refrain from killing them. It was a little unsporting to kill them after they'd been so helpful. After a few more moments, they shuddered and went still. When he was certain they weren't faking, he picked himself up and ran off down the path they directed him to. He met no one else as he flew up the stairs, and on the next floor up he discovered that his informant had been honest. Kusunagi's office really was hard to miss. Minato could see straight down the corridor and through the open door to where the man himself was flitting back and forth in a flurry of activity. Minato started forward. In the middle of his hectic rush he saw Kusunagi pause and lean down to speak into something on his desk. His voice echoed all around the corridors. Where is my equipment? If you idiots don't fetch it up here right now. He must have heard Minato's footsteps, as he suddenly broke off and turned expectantly. But the presumptuous expression lasted only a moment, replaced quickly with a sagging blankness of shock. Shock which quickly. Gekko had been having quite a bad week so far. Her commander had been kidnapped, his replacement seemed to think she was some kind of indentured tea lady instead of a jonin, and she had looked up her symptoms in the medical encyclopedia, and she definitely had mountain syndrome and about 2 weeks left to live if her self-diagnosis was correct. It was not with pleasure that she was called forth to report yet another failure to all the higher UPS who'd arrived at their small outpost looking for answers and accountability. The search and rescue squads couldn't trace their missing commander, and every day that passed was making the dead trail even colder. It was as the new commander was turning to her, no doubt to ask her to fetch everyone another round of tea, when something extraordinarily heavy landed in her lap and her vision filled with blonde. Sorry. Minato called apologetically when she careened across the room, wheezing as she rummaged through her pockets for her inhaler. A circle of astonished faces stared at him, and looking around he realized he'd appeared in his own cabin in the middle of some kind of meeting. His desk had been swept clean and turned into a conference table, and besides Gekko and Yuhi he counted his substitute, 3 ANBU captains minus their masks and 1 Hitaki Tsukumo sitting beside his very own sensei, the latter of whom appeared more amused than astonished. Judging by all the papers on the desk, they were very engrossed in search and rescue plans. A little help, please, he said, motioning his bound hands at them. Tsukumo was the first to get over his surprise and stood up. Cut him loose. Yuhi drew a kunai and carefully severed the straps cutting into Minato's wrists, but even when they fell away and the raw welts beneath were laid bare he had trouble extending his fingers. Pain shot through every bone and tendon like fire. One of the ANBU captains of the medical division came forward and immediately began to ease the wounds with his cooling chakra. Another of the ANBU captains rose from her seat beside Tsukumo. How good of you to join us, she said, perplexed. We were just discussing you. Organizing a party to celebrate, commiserate your disappearance, said Jiraiya with a devious twinkle in his eyes. Sorry to spoil your plans, Minato responded. Tsukumo interrupted them impatiently. Your report? I was being held in a Kumo base about 12 miles away to the northeast of here. Initially they were attempting to exchange me for Uzumaki Kushina, though when that failed they attempted to interrogate me. Yes, we got the strange ransom note, said Jiraiya, relaxing back in his chair. The Hokage didn't think the terms were very agreeable. Sorry about that. I told him not to worry, I had every faith you'd fight your way out eventually. What rubbish, the ANBU captain exploded at him. You've been running around like a headless chicken all week. When you weren't shouting at the new recruits and reducing them to tears, you were off sobbing in a corner yourself. Libel, declared Jiraiya furiously, springing upright again. Tsukumo's sharp tone cut through the room once more. That aside, Minato, your return is a great relief and we can talk about this more tomorrow after you've rested and recuperated. Right now it is our job to mobilize a force quickly and move in on this base. Even though Kumo no doubt sanctioned this, they've officially dissociated themselves with the ones responsible, which means we can deal with them as we wish. Kumo needs to be shown what happens when they kidnap our people and try to extort us. Kumo's planning an invasion soon, Minato told him. They won't be keeping up the peaceful pretense for much longer. How do you know this? Asked the ANBU captain. My captor was a very senior member of Kumo's intelligence section and a little too forthcoming when he thought I had no chance of escape. But since I'd given Gecko one of my kunai, I was able to leave at any time. I stuck around as long as I could to learn the reasons for wanting to abduct me and Kumo's plans in general. When the medical captain stepped away from him, Minato paused to look down at his hands, still badly marked and stinging, but at least he could flex his fingers fully. Oh, thank you, that's much better. Anyway, I only really returned so someone could cut me free. I'm not quite done with that base yet, so if you'll excuse me. He turned and went to the small closet where most of his gear had lain untouched in his absence. A new belt would be required. Smoke bombs, explosive tags, contract scrolls, a couple of kunai. He tested their sharpness on his already tattered sleeve and nodded in satisfaction when they sliced the fabric like it was soft butter. Behind him he heard the scrape of a chair as Jiraiya rose to his feet. Leave this one to us, Minato, he said. You've done enough. By the time you organize a force big enough to take the base and march it up the mountain, they'll have packed up and gone. We have only a few minutes at most. Minato slipped on a pair of gloves to protect his damaged hands and then paused, looking around the room for that one final thing he'd forgotten, but he knew he needed more than anything. He spotted the plate of half-eaten biscuits in the middle of the desk. Ah! He went over and stuffed most of them in his mouth in one go. After a week of the bare minimum, he was unbelievably hungry. The biscuits would have to do for now until he could get home and park himself before an Alley-Okaniate buffet for a few days. Or he could just park himself in front of Kushina and give her the puppy eyes. We should discuss this plan, said the ANBU captain urgently, which was typical of her profession. If a fire broke out in the ANBU headquarters, the captains would probably call a conference to decide what to do about it. This has been the plan for the best part of the week, Minato told her. Please. Do not concern yourselves. Minato, Jiraiya sighed helplessly. Swiping the last of the biscuits, he turned to Gecko. If you could keep minding that for me just a little bit longer, he said, pointing to the marked kunai dangling from her belt. I promise I'll aim myself a little more carefully next time. Sure thing, Taicho, she said faintly. To the others he nodded one last time. I'll be back shortly. Before they could raise another protest, he activated Hiration and stepped from the cozy warmth of his crowded cabin back into his dark, cold cell where the air was noticeably thinner. The chakra mark that he'd previously planted against the wall with his foot faded and he looked towards the door that had been left open invitingly wide. He swept through it and into the veins of the base. The empty corridors were narrow and quiet, and every couple of yards Minato ran his hand along the wall like a blind man feeling his way. It was an apt comparison since his probing chakra told him more about the structure of the base than his eyes could. Beyond these thick walls was pure rock and little else. The complex was a small one, more of a bolt hole than a base, constructed within a mountain and was most likely invisible from the outside. An expedition from the Konoha outpost would hike right past it if they didn't know what they were looking for. Static interference suddenly crackled through the hollow corridors. Minato was treated to the very unpleasant experience of hearing Kusunagi's disembodied voice screech through the base's intercom system. "Where is G and Akino? We're leaving in 5, if you haven't collected the transferals by then I'm leaving you behind and blowing the base with you in it." If everyone was on a first-name terms, there could only have been a handful of people occupying the base, which made sense given its small size. He'd made the right decision, he thought, raising a biscuit to his mouth to snap it in half. A clatter of boots echoed down the corridor ahead of him. Evidently someone didn't want to get blown up. When the first Kyumo nin ran around the corner and saw Minato, he braked so hard his companion ran into him from behind. "Slack-jawed," he pointed. "It's him. He's right there." Minato took 2 deft steps and grabbed the pointing hand, slamming its owner into the wall and twisting his arm high behind his back until he gave a distinctive whimper. The second Kyumo nin didn't hang back, and with one hand employed in restraining the first man and the other holding half a biscuit, there wasn't much he could do about it. He dodged the first punch. The second he deflected with his elbow. Before the increasingly desperate man could aim a third strike, Minato's foot lashed up, catching him in the stomach. A spluttering grunt bounced off the walls, followed by a sound thud as Minato hooked the toes of his sandal behind the man's heel and swept his feet out. Now with one man on the ground held in place by a foot against his throat and another pinned to the wall, Minato helped himself to the second half of his biscuit. "Where's Kusunagi's quarters, or wherever else is the center of operations here?" Neither man spoke. The one on the ground tried to reach for a kunai but quite wisely stopped, and Minato started to shift more of his weight onto the foot compressing his windpipe. "It's in your interests to talk to me," he warned them. "Either way I'm leaving you both unconscious, and if I don't find your boss before he blows up this base, you'll both be charred corpses tomorrow." "Round the corner, the way we came," said the man on the floor ever so quickly. "Up the stairs and then follow the corridor straight. It's the very end room, you can't miss it." "Gee," growled the man up against the wall, and began to struggle. Minato looked at him sharply. "Don't move." Perhaps he thought Minato was bluffing or that he wasn't being restrained so tightly. He continued to resist and tried to jerk his arm free of the lock, and in a small cascade of pops and snaps his elbow and shoulder shattered. His arm simply fell apart. Minato smothered his scream with his hand and quickly pushed the writhing man to the ground. He reached for their throats, probing a thumb behind their carotid artery to press and massage the hidden pulse point that caused paralysis and hastened unconsciousness. True to his word, he would refrain from killing them. It was a little unsporting to kill them after they'd been so helpful. After a few more moments, they shuddered and went still. When he was certain they weren't faking, he picked himself up and ran off down the path they directed him to. He met no one else as he flew up the stairs, and on the next floor up he discovered that his informant had been honest. Kusunagi's office really was hard to miss. Minato could see straight down the corridor and through the open door to where the man himself was flitting back and forth in a flurry of activity. Minato started forward. In the middle of his hectic rush he saw Kusunagi pause and lean down to speak into something on his desk. His voice echoed all around the corridors. "Where is my equipment? If you idiots don't fetch it up here right now." He must have heard Minato's footsteps, as he suddenly broke off and turned expectantly. But the presumptuous expression lasted only a moment, replaced quickly with a sagging blankness of shock. Shock which quickly began to tighten into fear. Not one step closer or I'll activate every tag in this base and bits of us will be raining into the sea for months. Kusanagi bleated. Minato didn't pause. His steadiness disconcerted his Kumo captor who was not used to being ignored, and in that vital moment the old man quailed in hesitation. Minato walked right up to him without breaking stride, and in one seamless move had spun him around by his shoulder and dragged a kunai through his throat. It was always a messy method, but quick, and Minato had long ago learned how to direct the blood spray elsewhere. Kusanagi gurgled and began to fall. Minato had moved on and forgotten him before his body hit the floor. The desk was his goal. He could see he'd interrupted Kusanagi's attempt to compile the documents he wished to take with him and separate the ones to be left behind and destroyed. An exploding tag had been stuck to the wooden surface between the stacks of files and papers, ready to detonate in just a few minutes. Minato scored it in half with his kunai, deactivating it effectively before he assumed Kusanagi's job, collecting the data that needed to be saved. He knew what to look for. As commander of his outpost he knew the likely keywords to look for and the places to find them. The most sensitive things were always the most innocuous. Minato picked up a file labeled Accounting and a quick flip through the documents within yielded quite a few accounts, including an account of the positions of similar bases, an account of how many operatives were serving under Kusanagi, and an account of Konoha's weakest defense points along the border. A heap of correspondence had been set aside in a box, probably to be burned with the remains of the base. Minato rescued the wad of assorted letters, knowing that although every stickler for the rules coded their messages, in the more casual and personal exchanges secrets were often dropped with alarming regularity. On a cork board behind him he found a map of the base, which was almost certainly a blueprint for similar bases nearby. He took it down, along with the photo of the smiling redhead beside it. He tucked the latter safely back into his vest pocket before he plucked a scroll from his hip and snapped it open. A rather large toad roughly the size of a Labrador appeared in the middle of the desk in a cloud of smoke. It began to give a croak of greeting before changing its mind. "Whoa, you know us toads explode at high altitudes," it gasped. "Buck up, Gamaken, it's not that bad," Minato said dismissively, neglecting to mention it had taken him more than a week to acclimatize enough to the conditions up here to even think about engaging in combat. Even now he was carefully trying to expend as little energy as possible. If he elevated his heart rate any higher than it was already he would undoubtedly faint. "What is it you need?" Gamaken asked. "I need you to open your mouth." "Why?" "Wog, sorry about this," he said, jamming his stack of files and papers into the toad's gullet. He felt a little bad about it, but Jiraiya always assured him his summons were remarkably stretchy. "I need you to take these quickly and securely to Jiraiya-sensei. He'll want to pass them along to the Hokage as soon as possible." The files disappeared and Minato quickly withdrew his hand from the toad's slimy mouth. Gamaken licked his wide lips, showing little evidence that anything so unnatural had just taken place. "Can do," he said. "But why can't you take them? I want to stay a little longer and keep looking. In the meantime, get this to Sensei," he said urgently. "It's very important. Very important. Don't digest." "Gotcha." Gamaken squatted his front legs slightly, possibly the frog equivalent of a bow, and vanished abruptly. Minato resumed his search, raiding every cupboard and drawer and alcove he could find. He couldn't let anything escape his notice now. This was a rare chance to raid the office of a very high-ranking member of Kumo's force, and Minato had no intention of overlooking anything. If war was truly coming, this was life and death for who knew how many people. He ripped out the desk drawers to look for hidden compartments, poked his fingers into the light fittings in the ceiling, and pulled over the empty filing cabinet in the corner to make sure Kusanagi hadn't hidden anything behind it. Tugging the cork board off the wall seemed the next logical step in his thorough dismantlement of the office, but he was richly rewarded when it revealed the thick door of a safe. Unfortunately for Minato, it was a safe designed by and for Shinobi. A regular safe was easy to crack even without using chakra, but Minato only had to pass his hand over this one to feel the stringent precautions in place. All kinds of seals and wards must have been built into it because Minato's chakra couldn't penetrate it at all. There was no telling what was inside. Had Kusanagi intended to open it or leave it to be destroyed? If Minato had just held back a few more minutes, perhaps he wouldn't be here having to figure out how to open it himself. Shouldn't have killed him, he sighed to himself, shooting the body on the floor an annoyed glance as if it was Kusanagi's fault for inconveniencing him. Why do I always end up saying that? Minato probed a little chakra into the lock and was soundly rebuffed. Frowning deeply, he began to physically turn the dial, but he already knew it was hopeless. There were millions of combinations to choose from and he didn't have the time or patience to crack the code manually. His hearing certainly wasn't sensitive enough to discern one little click from the next. Someone like Hitachi Tsukumo, or even Kushina, could probably just press their ear to the door, but Minato either had to find the code quickly or open the safe with force, and he neither thought Kusanagi was stupid enough to leave the code for his safe anywhere but inside his own head, nor had force ever been his forte. He still had to try. Stepping back a little, he lifted his hand and began to draw chakra into his palm and rotate it. It spun faster and tighter until the light of the swirling ball of chakra tinged the room a faint blue. It may not have been finished, but for this purpose, the Rasengan might just do. But when he slammed the whirling energy against the door of the safe, it did little more than scuff the paintwork and leave a faint dint before dissipating. Minato paused, panting a little from the exertion and wondering what to do next. He knew he couldn't expend much more energy, just using Rasengan made him feel faint and lightheaded. He heard a terrific bellow from the corridor behind him. Stop right there. He turned. Someone was barreling down the corridor towards the office like a bull charging for a red flag. It looked like it had finally caught up to him. As quick as the flash he was named for, Minato hopped over the desk and reached for the heavy door. Kicking Kusanagi's arm out the way, he slammed it shut and bolted it, but not before he threw a handful of smoke bombs into the corridor. The noxious gas would fill the airspace and slow it down, at least for a minute or two. Minato just needed those few extra minutes. Since he didn't have much left to lose, Minato went for the crude method. He overturned Kusanagi's desk chair and cut off one of its metal legs with a chakracharged kunai. The tapered tip was just narrow enough to slide between the safe's door and its frame, and if he could just push hard enough the office door exploded inwards. Minato ducked instinctively, only narrowly avoiding being turned into a smear against the wall as the door, knocked right off its sturdy hinges, ripped through the desk and ended its violent flight scant inches away from where he'd been standing. Minato felt like someone had dropped a bucket of loose nuts and bolts into his brain. His nerves jangled as he stared at the shattered desk and the smoke pouring in through the hole where the door used to be, and the huge man stepping inside without a hair out of place. Looked down at Kusanagi's body and merely grunted. Figures, he drawled, shifting his hooded gaze to Minato. I don't doubt turnabout is fair play after what we did to you. Tried to do. But it ends here. Go now or you'll be joining Kusanagi. Minato's back was pressed quite hard to the wall like he was unconsciously trying to sink through it. Was giving him a free pass to leave because he knew there was no realistic way he could stop Minato using Hiraishin again, and frankly it was very tempting to take that advice. Seeing him punch through that door did things to one's stomach, and it did not leave him eager to see what his punches could do to a human body. But a terrible, dangerous idea had just popped into Minato's head, and he could not shake it free. Your boss went down a little easy, he said to A. Is someone like him really your superior? Head of the intelligence division, A. grunted flatly. All brains and no brawn, that lot. In his case, he's a politician, so no brains either. Maybe I just did you a favor then. No, you just gave me a shit load of paperwork. Not to mention I was looking forward to the day I could start making him squirm when I became his superior. A lifted his enormous fists and began to crack his knuckles. Minato remained rooted to the spot. "Oh, that's right," he said, seizing on this opening. "You're going to be Hokage one day, aren't you? Is that because you're the strongest in your village, or because of your brother?" A went still, eyes narrowing sharply on him. "Excuse me? I hear that in your village the Hokage is chosen because of his relation to the eight-tailed monster. That's your brother, right? If they have to select the Hokage from his pool of relatives, I'm guessing you're his only family." "Pretty much," said A, eyeing Minato like pesky fly he was debating whether or not to swat. He needed more pushing. "Or is it the other way around?" Minato continued. "Is the host of the Eight Tails chosen because of his relation to you? Being the reason your brother is turned into a monster has to suck. How long do you think this one will last out? The previous host only lasted 6 months, right? And the one before that was less than 3 weeks? How long before your little brother goes berserk and kills everyone and leaves you to pick up the pieces? I suppose it doesn't matter, you must have spare little brothers, right?" A surged forward, fist raised and face set. Either Minato had enraged him to the point of seeing red, or he was just bored listening to him ramble, but the effort had paid off. Minato threw himself to the side a split second before A's charged fist smashed against the wall where he'd been standing. Concrete cracked and exploded out, filling the room with a cloud of dust to add to the gas from the smoke bombs. Something else beside concrete skidded across the floor beside Minato. He looked up and saw the dial from the safe scudding through the remains of the desk. Triumphantly he rolled upright and looked back at the hole A had made. The corner of the wall safe had taken the brunt of the blow, its door was missing, as was a large part of its frame and the concrete wall beside it, and now heavy Kumo coins were trickling out onto the floor like a waterfall of money. Even A was momentarily bemused, looking down in confusion at the coins collecting at his feet. Minato was not interested in Kusunagi's personal or professional wealth. His eyes had landed on a thin manila envelope that teetered on the lip of the safe, about to slip onto the floor. Quickly, before A could regroup himself, Minato shot forward, dashing between A and the safe and snatching the envelope as he passed. He was brought to a screeching halt when one of A's impossibly strong hands caught his hair. The other seized his wrist, holding it immobile in a crushing grip that almost caused Minato to drop his prize. Mouth open in a silent cry of pain, Minato held himself very still. "By all accounts you'll be the next Hokage yourself, Namikaze Minato," said A, restraining him effortlessly. "So let me give you a piece of advice." He pulled Minato's head closer to his so that Minato couldn't miss a nuance of the contempt and anger that twisted in A's face. "As long as you cling to the old bigotry and prejudices, the day you become Hokage is going to be the beginning of a dark era for Konoha. If someone like you is the best Konoha can offer, there'll never be peace between us, and if you're ones to talk about peace." Raising his chakra up to the surface, it lashed around his skin in its purest elemental form. And when concentrated enough, wind could cut like fine razor blades. Little snicks and snips plucked at Minato's clothes, ripping and tearing them. Great chunks of his own hair rained down around his shoulders. Most importantly, A lost his purchase and wheeled away, fingers bleeding. At once Minato formed a new series of seals and pushed his hand towards the enormous man. A blast of air rocked the room. Whatever had been tenaciously clinging to the walls so far finally fell away, joining the pieces of the desk and loose coins that rose from the floor and shot with hurricane force straight for A. Battered by the onslaught, the big man stumbled back into the far wall, lifting his arms to protect his face. Kushina's techniques came in awfully handy sometimes, but Minato couldn't keep it up. The air was already too thin, his heart was hammering like an overly tight drum in his chest, and he dropped the jutsu as a wave of profound weakness swept over him. When the shrapnel fell away, A brushed the chips of wood from his shoulders with his bleeding hands like they were bits of lint. You're out of your element here, he remarked. How can you lecture about peace to me, Minato gasped out, ignoring him, when your village is planning to wage war on us over a misunderstanding? When you inflict constant turmoil and violence on yourselves because of your pursuit of bijou? You don't have the right to talk about peace. Bijou are the path to absolute power and absolute peace, said A, or have you forgotten how the founding father of your village used them? He never implanted them into anyone. Minato bristled. That kind of cruelty is unforgivable. It's true my brother B will always suffer cruelty and hardship, but not because of any bijou. A's glare was low and dark. His suffering will always be at the hands of people like you. And all the Jinchuriki before him who were driven mad and forced to become instruments of slaughter by their own insanity? What about them? Minato demanded coldly. Or are we supposed to forget about them? Acceptable collateral, said A, along with all their victims, no doubt. Minato shook his head in disbelief. A snapped some of the congealing blood from his hands and rolled his shoulders. It seems we won't agree on this, he said, and you've had your run of this base long enough. And he attacked. It was easy to look at someone as large and physically powerful as A and assume he would be a similar opponent to Jiraiya, rock-like and immovable, hard to injure but slow in movement. So it was easy to be taken aback when Minato could barely stay ahead of him. A's body took on a charged hue, encased by an aura of chakra, and when he punched, Minato ducked, but only just. When he picked up one of the desk drawers to smash it over Minato's head, he threw himself to the floor, but barely in time. And when A lifted a foot to stomp him through the concrete floor, Minato rolled away, but only with scant millimeters to spare. Smoke bombs slipped from his pouch and cracked open, engulfing Minato in a cloud of gray. His spare hand groped for something, anything, to throw and landed on a chip of plaster. It would do. No sooner had he touched it than he marked it, then threw it as true as an arrow at A's head. A saw it coming, of course. Even from the cover of a smoke screen his reactions were fast enough to avoid sharp little projectiles. He inclined his head and let the piece of plaster slip harmlessly past his ear to rebound against the ceiling. His mistake in ignoring it registered just one fraction too late for A, and gratingly early for Minato. A began to turn. Minato landed on his back, and the kunai he'd been aiming for A's neck sunk into the slab of muscle that was A's shoulder and no further. It might have been devastating for anyone else, but for a man this size it was nothing more than a flesh wound. Minato sprang back, attempting to gain distance as A lashed out. One heavy fist connected with Minato's ribs and knocked him flying into the severely beaten filing cabinet. I think we've had our fun now, A said, walking over to Minato's stunned form as if he couldn't even feel the kunai sticking out of his shoulder. It's time for our goodbyes. He charged his fist one last time and struck, and it was not Minato he aimed for, but the wall beside him. The support gave out and the plaster cracked. Minato had time enough to register the crushing concrete blocks falling on him before his body reacted instinctively. By the time his mind caught up he was lying in the middle of the outer quad of his outpost, being peered at by a curious gecko and a platoon of Chunin. Taicho? Gecko, who was perhaps beginning to grow accustomed to his sudden appearances, snapped to attention. You're back, sir. Patting himself down to make sure he definitely hadn't been crushed, Minato sat up slowly and probed for the tagged kunai he'd left in A's shoulder. He detected it for only a brief moment before it was snuffed out like a distant light in the darkness and he felt no more. A had destroyed it. By collapsing the wall he'd forced Minato to activate Hiration to escape and then had promptly destroyed Minato's only means of getting back. But it hadn't been a total loss, he thought, looking down at the badly scuffed and bent envelope in his hand. Taicho, what happened? Gecko asked, reaching down to help him up. You look as bad as I feel. Yes, his clothes were a little worse for wear and he had inadvertently chopped most of his hair off, but it had to be said that these were mostly self-inflicted. The bruised ribs and loose tooth, however, were A's handiwork. "I'm fine," he said, which was mostly true. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at the team of Chunin. "That ANBU woman is organizing a team to locate the base," Gecko told him. "She says, forget it," he said, approaching the Chunin with a raised voice. "Field trip cancelled. You can all disarm and go back to your barracks." This was met with groans of disappointment, but obediently they began to disperse. Almost at once the door to his cabin opened and people streamed out. Jiraiya, Tsukumo, and Yuhi, headed by the ANBU captain. "What's the meaning of this?" she asked, sounding more curious than anything. "An expedition to the base is out of the question," Minato told her. "There's a man called A up there, and the Chunin of this base aren't equipped to deal with him or the conditions. It's best we leave it for now. Besides, I've already dealt with the man responsible and recovered as much intelligence as I could." "I got the papers you sent with Gamaken," Jiraiya told him. "They should be with the Hokage by now." "I got this too," Minato said, holding up the manila envelope. "What is it?" the captain asked. "I don't know. The man in charge there was keeping it in his safe, so I figured it had to be important. If it turned out to be the first chapter draft of Kusunagi's pompous autobiography, Minato was going to be very annoyed." The captain accepted the envelope and handed it off to Tsukumo. "I see," she said. "Thank you for your hard work tonight. But may I suggest you take some rest now? You look like you need it." Minato nodded gratefully, suddenly feeling exactly as tired as he should have been feeling hours ago. Jiraiya's arm slung around his shoulder in the guise of camaraderie, with a blithe comment of, "Nice haircut, kid," though he knew his sensei was holding him up and steering him towards the cabin before he dropped in an embarrassing heap in the middle of the quad. "Sensei," he began wearily as they entered into the quiet office that connected to his private room. "I think I may have missed the festival." "Yes, I think you did," Jiraiya said cheerfully. How annoyed was Kushina? "Very," he reassured him. "But she was quite relieved to hear you'd been kidnapped." "What?" "Yes, a girl is much happier when the reason her boy stood her up is because he is being held captive by ruthless enemy Nin than because he couldn't be bothered making time for her." "Well, at least she's happy." "Oh, no, Minato, she's been quite upset. It's one thing to think your boyfriend stood you up, but to learn he's actually being held captive by ruthless enemy Nin? Who, boy? I don't get it." "Women, Minato." Jiraiya shook his head as if this explained everything. "Women. It sort of did. I suppose I did let myself get captured on purpose," Minato sighed. Jiraiya had escorted him into his room and had directed him to slump on the bed. "I should try to make it up to her." "You'll have plenty of time for that," said Jiraiya, patting him on the head like he was still a 10-year boy as opposed to a 21-year-old man. "You'll be coming back to Konoha with us when we leave to report to the Hokage. He'll be willing to let you retire a little early from this post in light of everything that's happened." "That's nice," Minato yawned. "As long as we go by boat." "I don't think it makes much difference time-wise, but why by boat?" "There's something I need to pick up." 2 days later, Konoha's yellow flash was safely restored to his village, though word that he'd single-handedly destroyed yet another base had made the rounds long before he arrived through the gates. His reputation, he felt, was going to start exerting its own gravitational force at the rate it was growing. It had been difficult parting ways with the outpost he'd called home for the last 2 years. Gecko had teared up, claiming allergies, and Yuhi had gone on about it being an honor and a privilege as if Minato was dying instead of simply going home. His Chunin subordinates had thrown an impromptu party in his honor the night before he left, and were not content until it seemed each and every one had bought him a beer. Whether this was out of affection for him or out of malicious retribution for all those drills he'd made them do in the sleet and snow, Minato wasn't sure. He had a thumping headache most of the way to Konoha. Hatake Tsukumo insisted it was quite urgent that they make their way directly to the Hokage when they got back. Minato would have preferred to slink home and find Kushina, but he understood that Tsukumo had seen something in those documents from Kusunagi's safe that had put him in an unusually dark mood. It seemed a little unnecessary, however. Tsukumo and Jiraiya went to consult with the Hokage in privacy, leaving Minato in the waiting room to consult with boredom. They hadn't decided yet if Minato was cleared to be included in the discussion of the information he himself had found. One of the Hokage's aides brought him a glass of cool juice while he was waiting and all but melted when treated to his grateful smile. He had settled down to stretch out and examine his toes when the sound of raised voices drifted through the door to the corridor. "You know me, you see me here all the time, what's the problem? The Hokage's in a meeting and he's not to be disturbed." "It's not the Hokage I want to disturb. It's the rules. No one's permitted, let me tell you where you can go stuff those rules." Minato bounded across the waiting room and threw open the door. Kushina. She had just started to bodily grapple with the guard outside, but the moment she saw him her face lit up like a child presented with her favorite toy. "Minato, I'm so glad would you let me go?" "It's okay," he said to the guard who had his arms wrapped around her. "Let her in." She ducked beneath the guard's slack arms and into the waiting room before he could change his mind. "I've been so worried, everyone said you were back, I'm so relieved, I was beginning to think I'd never see you again, I knew you'd be okay though, oh no, your poor face. Your horrible hair. What happened?" Although the bruise they had given him had healed significantly, he'd still been left with an impressive mottling of yellow and purple across his cheek and jaw. Kushina lifted her hand as if to trace the injury, but her fingers didn't quite dare to touch his skin. "I'm okay," he told her. "It looks worse than it is. I can't believe this happened because of me," she sighed angrily. "Isn't it normally the little woman that gets kidnapped to get to the hero? What the hell, Minato? You got it the wrong way round, as usual. You did warn me they'd come for you to get to your father's techniques." She chewed her lip guiltily. "The Hokage suspected they were after me for my condition. I wanted to give myself up but he wouldn't let me." Good. Good. For them maybe. I totally would have kicked their asses for hurting you. Nobody messes up my boyfriend's face and lives. I was never in any real danger, he reassured her, stroking a lock of crimson hair back behind her ear. "I'm just sorry I missed the festival." "Oh, whatever." She shook her head exuberantly, dislodging her hair again. "Better to have you back late than never. I still felt bad, so I got you a present." Her eyes narrowed and her mouth dropped open a fraction. "Seriously? Seriously? You're a serious lunatic, you know that," she snorted in a very unladylike manner. "Only you would spend a week in a Kumo prison and come back with souvenirs." "Well, not quite. Do you want your present or not?" A shy grin spread across her face and she wrinkled her nose adorably. "Seriously?" He wasn't starting that again. Taking her hand, he dragged her over to the chair where he'd left his traveling pack. Kushina peered curiously around him as he slipped open a side pocket and withdrew a bulging paper bag. It was quite tricky getting hold of these, he told her as he stripped the outer paper away and placed the inner, plastic bag filled with water into her hands. "Since I didn't get the chance to win you any goldfish, these will have to do." "But these are..." Kushina trailed off, staring at the bag in her hands. Within it swam 3 little red fish with fins like billowing sails. "These are my fish. I've only ever seen them in, don't tell me you went to Whirlpool." "If you go by boat, it's not far out of the way," he said. "I remembered you saying how you used to catch them when you were younger, so, here you are." "How could you have remembered something like that?" She gaped at him. "That was years ago. I always seem to remember the things you say. But I say a lot of crap." "Yes, I know. He smiled and tucked that obstinate lock of hair aside again. Do you like them? Oh my god, yes, she blurted happily. I'm going to buy an aquarium and then some rocks, and they prefer salt water if I remember right, and I'll get them some plants, and this one's going to be called Fugueface because he looks like a horrible little brute. I'm glad you like them, he interrupted. I risked life and limb getting them, you know. I had to beat off a shark at one point. There aren't any sharks around Whirlpool, she reminded him briskly. Then it was probably some kind of enormous saltwater crocodile. It even bit me. She gasped. Where? He rolled up his sleeve to show her his arm. Right there, he pointed. She looked closely. I don't see anything. Look right there, next to that freckle. When she only scrutinized his skin even more hopelessly, he sighed and pulled his sleeve down again. Okay. It looked worse before. Kushina looked up at him again with a wry smile. You're so brave, she told him, without any kind of conceit, and moved forward on tiptoes to hug him. And so thoughtful and stupid and ugh so thin. When did you get so bony? He thought. Probably around the time some Kyomo-nin put me on a starvation diet. She looked horrified. You need to go home and eat, she ordered, as the door to the Hokage's office opened up behind them. You're going to slip between the cracks in the floorboards if you're not careful. Leave him alone, Kushina, said Tsukumo from the doorway. He's healthy enough, she whirled on him. You may be fine with being a skinny rake, sensei, but don't you start being a bad influence on Minato. He nodded. Yes, yes. Minato, could you step inside now? Minato looked at Kushina, who shrugged. I'll head home, she told him. Be back by 6 and I'll make dinner. All your favorite things. Not a herd of stampeding elephants or even more Kyomo-nin could possibly stop him. He told her so, and she smiled, and leant up to press a quick kiss to his cheek, mindful of the fact that her sensei was standing there boring holes into the side of Minato's head with his eyes. She took her fish and absconded. Minato turned to Tsukumo in satisfaction. You've failed the first rule of giving women gifts, Tsukumo told him seriously. Never give a girl something she'll prize more than you. Minato refused to be psyched. I doubt if those fish got kidnapped by Kyomo she'd consider trading herself in for their release, he retorted as he moved past him into the office. Don't bet on it, said Tsukumo, warned sinisterly. He's right, said Jiraiya, who was occupying one of 2 chairs before the Hokage's desk. His feet were occupying the other. When you told me you were going to get Kushina's childhood fish, I knew you were doomed. She's going to go home and sweep all your pictures off the sideboard to make space for their tank. That's your problem, Minato. You're too damn thoughtful. It's painful to watch, Tsukumo said. Excruciating, added Jiraiya. Isn't that right, sensei? Quite, agreed the Hokage, although he didn't appear to be paying attention. His gaze was focused on the set of papers before him, which he looked up from reluctantly to gesture to Minato. Take a seat, please. Jiraiya obligingly removed his feet, allowing Minato to slide onto the chair while Tsukumo stood vigil behind them. I suppose the first and most pressing question is, are these documents genuine? The Hokage began. You said you found these in a safe in the base. In the office of one Umage Kusanagi? That's right, nodded Minato. I can't tell you if they're genuine or not, only how I found them. So he repeated his story to the Hokage, about his rash decision to allow his capture in order to gather intelligence and all the events in between till the moment he'd returned to his outpost with those papers in hand. You say this, suspected you had purposefully allowed your capture? The Hokage said, running fingers over dry lips. He must have suspected you were trying to mine information, so is there any chance he planted these for you to find? I'm not sure, Minato admitted. The thought hadn't occurred to him. It was Kusanagi's office and Kusanagi's safe, although he did technically open the safe for me, he did seem surprised by the fact. And I'm almost certain none of them expected me to return when I did, so I'm not sure they would have had time to prepare false information. Kusanagi definitely didn't see me coming. Literally caught me when I had those documents in my hand, but he didn't try to recover them, so whether that means he wanted me to take them or he didn't know or care what they were. Hokage-sama, I don't know. The Hokage grunted. As far as intelligence officials go, Kusanagi was not the most brilliant. If he was responsible for anticipating the intelligence leak and mocking this up, it's a real piece of work. Especially since it goes a long way to explaining the puzzling findings of our own intelligence officials. Such as why have Kumo troops been seen moving freely in the IWA-occupied regions of the waterfall country? Why, when IWA is accusing every village on the continent of infractions against them, are they sparing Kumo alone of any criticism? And why, when our sources report that Kumo Nin captured the five-tailed bijou 6 months ago, they have made no attempt whatsoever to implant it into one of their citizens despite their zealous history of doing just that at the first opportunity? Minato shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And what do the documents say? The Hokage passed the papers to Minato and gestured for him to read as he gave a brief overview. These documents are correspondence from the Raikage to Kusanagi, the latter of whom was apparently spearheading several operations. One of which was to screen potential hosts for their two-tailed bijou. The other, to screen hosts for a five-tailed bijou. Yes, he mentioned he wanted Kushina because her chakra supposedly made her an ideal host or something, Minato murmured. But I don't understand what is so unusual about that. Kusanagi drew up a list of candidates to be the host of the five-tailed bijou. We don't have the full list, but the Raikage shortlisted them and their names are on the next page if you'd like to turn to it. Yes. Do you notice anything unusual about those names? There were about 12 names in total, and at first glance he saw nothing strange about them whatsoever. By the 10th name, however, it began to dawn on Minato what was so odd. These aren't traditional Kumo names, he said suddenly. And I know this guy, he's in the bingo book. He's from IWA. Yes, they're screening IWA Nin for hosts. Apparently with their consent. They're giving a bijou to IWA? Minato skimmed hurriedly through the rest of the correspondence. A peace offering? Or a pact, Tsukumo finished for him gravely. IWA and Kumo are affirming their sudden and rather inexplicable bond of friendship over a commonality. Their commonality being their shared hatred of Konoha, Jiraiya interjected. Kumo wants to wage war against us and they're wooing IWA to join them with gifts of bijou, not that IWA needs much convincing. And under the combined might of IWA and Kumo together, things begin to look grim for little old us in the middle. Not if we interfere, said Tsukumo. With this information, we have a very narrow advantage. IWA will be sending their chosen host to Kumo for implantation, and if all goes according to plan, they both go home happy. But if something were to go horribly awry, like say, the host is killed in Kumo before implantation, or the bijou is released or stolen, IWA and Kumo won't be so friendly anymore. This could be a prime opportunity to betray their trust in one another and set them at each other's throats. It's ambitious, but I see no alternative, sighed the Hokage, leaned back in his chair and turning slightly to regard rooftops of his village through the window. According to the other documents you recovered, Kumo plans to initiate an invasion soon. We could hold them at bay well enough normally, but if they coordinate an invasion with IWA who is already close to matching us in strength and size, we might not be able to hold two fronts. What about this business with the abductions? Minato asked suddenly. Kumo says their people are going missing and they blame us. If we can resolve it, what is there to resolve? The Hokage demanded, tiredness and irritation pulling at his features. Given how much grief Minato had been given by the Kyumo emissary over this subject and learning that the Hokage was facing such accusations from all sides, he realized this was a well-beaten topic for the old man. We're not responsible, and I can say it till I'm blue in the face. They want war and they will cling to whatever reason they can think of. Are all the accusations baseless? Minato asked, knowing the other three men were now acutely focused on him. And not in a good way. They seem to really believe their people are going missing, as do other villages. Even if they're pointing the finger at the wrong people, is it that hard to believe they're all lying? After all, we had the same problem. Shinobi going missing, newborn stolen, with the victim suspected of being experimented on. It sounds too familiar. We thought we resolved the problem when it was ours, but what if we didn't? The Hokage shook his head firmly. Minato, we caught the man responsible. He committed suicide rather than face capture. It's no coincidence the abductions ceased after that, except they've only ceased here, just round about the same time they started elsewhere. Orochimaru conducted the investigation himself, the Hokage began. It's not like Precious Orokin is infallible, Jiraiya interrupted. If whoever is taking these people can fool multiple villages into blaming the wrong people, he can certainly fool even Orochimaru. The Hokage was not pleased, and his finger drummed the arm of his chair restlessly as he scowled at the documents upon his desk. Even if we were to do what we could not do 5 years ago and bring this criminal to justice, what then? Do you really think the other villages will lay down their arms and thank us? Abductions are not their reason, it is their excuse. We can give them the man or men responsible, and they will only respond that they are our scapegoats. It doesn't matter what we do, and we can't devote resources to capturing this entity when we face an unprecedented alliance between two extremely powerful enemy states. Meager placatory actions now is like slapping a band-aid on a severed limb. Too much of a bother, you mean, Minato suggested mildly. Because who cares if people are being kidnapped and slaughtered as long as they're not our people? Jiraiya kicked him discreetly. Should you ever become Hokage, Minato, and God help us all if that happens, the third Hokage said sharply, let us pray you are never faced with the choice to save a handful of the enemy at the cost of the lives of countless of our own. Now please let us move on from this unpleasant subject before I lose my temper. Minato suspected he may have already lost it, but dutifully sat back and sealed his lips for the rest of the meeting. It was agreed eventually that Tsukumo would lead the mission to intercept the bijou exchange between Kyumo and IWA, either to assassinate the IWA host or wreak some pandemonium with the bijou itself, whichever opportunity struck first. It sounded like a singularly difficult mission that would involve infiltrating the heart of Kyumo undetected when it was at its highest alert. Minato offered to assist and was shot down in no uncertain terms. Jiraiya said he needed to rest, while Tsukumo dryly remarked that their joint missions to other villages never ended well. The Hokage just eyed him like he was looking at a dirty hippie. Oh, I'm sure he'll get over it, said Kushina later. That's how he looks at me all the time. Is that because you always argue with him or because you broke his nephew's heart? Minato asked. She grunted as she checked the salt levels in her new fish tank. Not sure about that. Maybe he just doesn't like you criticizing his best student. Speaking of that weirdo, you know he's mentoring a little girl now? I've seen them together in town sometimes. I'm surprised they let someone like that even near children. Creeps me the hell out. Once she was satisfied that the tank water was perfectly balanced, she turned away from it, leaving her new fishy friends floating in the bag on top. She smiled at him with her hands behind her back. Why don't you go wash and get changed and I'll make you dinner? What would you like? Anything. Whatever you make, I like. Kushina could make even reheated noodles taste divine. That makes it easy, she said, beaming sweetly at him. Upstairs, Minato washed the built-up grime from his skin and hair and checked his bruises in the mirror. They weren't very dashing, not even in the bad boy sense. His face just looked discolored and ever so slightly lopsided, while the marks on his hands and arms from his binding still looked like he'd tangled with an angry jellyfish. The ANBU medic captain had offered to heal them completely, but Minato had refused. He planned to show them off later to Kushina, who was always very sympathetic to even his most minor injuries and might even offer to kiss them better. His hair was another matter. Yuhi had done his best with a pair of scissors to even out the catastrophe Minato had wrought, but it had to be said that Yuhi was not a master stylist, and Minato had not left much for him to work with. Still, there wasn't much Kushina's strawberry-scented hair gel couldn't tame. Sufficiently groomed, he went and dressed in his familiar old clothes, which were indeed a little looser than he remembered. And as he pulled on his favorite lavender shirt, he kept glancing over at his bed. He couldn't help noticing it had been completely stripped of its sheets and covers, and piled high with boxes full of assorted junk. That was a pain. He'd been hoping to just crawl into it later without having to make it first. In the kitchen, Kushina was poking a wooden spoon into a bubbling pot that was just beginning to give off the first whiffs of deliciousness. Minato sat down at the table with an appreciative sigh and thought he ought to get kidnapped more often. He could get used to this kind of treatment. "I hope you like ramen," she said. When she glanced over and witnessed the dopey smile on his face, she shook her head in amused confusion. "What? I've not seen you in a while," he explained. "I'm just enjoying the view." "Pervert," she grunted. Well, he hadn't quite meant it like that. He began a ham-fist apology, insisting he hadn't been staring at her ass, but Kushina snorted at this and came to sit with him. "It's not like I'd mind if you were," she said without looking him in the eye, and reached across the table to pull his hand over to her. She examined it closely, tracing the marks of the binding and the blue veins on his inner wrist that seemed especially stark against his skin after long days without a drop of sunlight. Her thumb followed the lines inside his palm to the tip of his fingers to explore his blunt nails, the swell of his knuckles, and the tiny hairs that tickled under her touch. She was focused, unusually so, and throughout the subtle intimacy he didn't take his eyes off her face. And he hated to interrupt her, but eventually he had to point it out. "The pot's boiling over." "WHO." She jumped up and lowered the temperature gauge, then stood looking at it irritably as if she could somehow shame it into feeling guilty. It was hard to imagine how anyone could have thought she was a Jinchuriki. She may have been odd, but he was willing to put her within the spectrum of what would be considered normal for someone who had grown up borderline feral. Anyone who had seen a real Jinchuriki would realize how ridiculous the notion was. The one he'd seen in Suna had been more animal than man, immobilized for his safety and the safety of the village, locked in a prison of his own body. The only sign of life had been the odd revolting quiver which had seemed more like the random firing of faulty synapses than conscious will. He looked at Kushina collecting 2 bowls from the cupboard, and the difference to him was like night and day. How could Kusanagi, who at the very least had come across the right-tailed Jinchuriki, make that kind of mistake? However, he'd raised other questions that Minato himself had never fully understood. "Whirlpool's a pretty interesting place," he began, wondering a little too late if this was the wisest time to pursue the subject. "But while I was over there getting your fish, something struck me as a little odd." "What did?" she asked absently. "I know there was a civil war and everything, but Whirlpool is in complete ruin," he said. "I've seen towns and even cities torn up by war, but never like that, not unless there was some kind of massive bombing campaign that goes way beyond anything I've ever heard of." "The reformists were not your average warmongers," she said distractedly, shooting him a confused glance. "What are you getting at? There was a natural disaster that hit your island before the war, wasn't there? That's what caused most of the damage, right?" The wooden spoon that had been stirring the noodles paused, but only for a split second. Kushina turned away, her shoulders hitched just a little higher than before. "Yeah, so? What was it exactly?" She shrugged sharply. "How should I know? I don't remember." I was like 6 when it happened. All I remember are the reformists. Then, oddly, she suddenly decided to remember. It was an earthquake. I think. Minato had never seen her looking as cagey and evasive as she did now. Her words came in jerky sentences like for some reason he'd suddenly managed to annoy her. Kusanagi, the guy who caught me, he seemed to think the Kyuubi attacked the island. Well, that's just silly. Kushina furiously banged her spoon against the edge of the pot, before slapping it down on the counter. Whoever heard of such a stupid thing? The Kyuubi's not attacked anything in, like, 70 years. Minato's hands flattened on the table. Is that thing even real? Well, yeah, she looked back at him uncertainly. Isn't it? I know there are other bijou, he said. Our founder is the only man in history who ever had dominion over all of them, and last I checked that was 8. The Kyuubi can't be real. I mean, the strength of the other bijou is incredible, but the Kyuubi is on a whole other level. A totally malevolent spirit that can wipe mountain ranges off the map in a second. The world couldn't contain that kind of power. How could it exist? It's like the sixth sense, or the fourth dimension. People like to speculate, but the 9th bijou is nothing more than a myth. You don't think there could be more than 8? She asked. If there's 9 bijou, why not 10? Why not 11? He shook his head. If the Shodai couldn't control it, I doubt it exists. If you're so sure it doesn't exist, why bring it up? Kushina turned contemplatively back to her cooking. Because if it wasn't the Kyuubi that destroyed your village, what was it? I told you I don't remember, she said impatiently. The history books don't seem to remember either. You'd think the disaster that killed the second leader would be a noteworthy event, but I don't remember a single mention, not even a footnote. Are you sure you don't remember? I was 6, she repeated. Minato sat back in his chair, unsatisfied, but he could see the clear signs that Kushina was closing up on him like an obstinate little clam. When she didn't want to talk about something, pushing her could make her sulk for days, and he didn't want to fall out so soon after returning home. In silence, Kushina poured her noodle broth into 2 bowls and set one of them before him. Gaze turned down, she handed him a pair of chopsticks, then got to work slurping down her own portion. She paused long enough to look critically at his thin wrists that remained resting on the table. Eat, she said. Or I'll force-feed you. That would be interesting, he retorted cheekily, lifting a slice of radish to his lips. They ate quietly for a while. Kushina gradually slowed down, cooling off enough to start savoring her meal. When she suddenly stopped, Minato looked up to see what was wrong. Kushina would never leave a bowl of ramen half-eaten. I genuinely don't remember, she told him, more easily than before, though she still refused to meet his eyes. The earth was shaking and there was panic, and my mother made me hide under the stairs. Then my father came. I don't remember anything else. I doubt anyone else who survived saw much either, but if it was the Kyuubi. She looked up at him, and he saw her. Eyes were an unusually dark blue tonight. If it was the Kyuubi, she went on, my village wouldn't have advertised it. It said the Kyuubi only appears where humanity is rotting. Malevolence attracts malevolence. If the Kyuubi comes for you, it's not something to be proud of, and maybe there is something in that. We fought ourselves into virtual extinction within 3 years, so maybe there was something rotten in us after all. Do you really think that's what happened? He asked her, watching her closely as she poked her noodles unenthusiastically. Why is it important? She shot back. This Kusanagi guy sounds like he had some screws loose. That ransom note he sent? Kept referring to me as a freaking jewel. If you hadn't killed him I would have asked for a restraining order just to be sure. Yeah, he had some pretty weird ideas, Minato agreed. Get this, he even had it in his head that you were the 9-tailed Jinchuriki. Kushina stared at him. I know, right? He lifted his bowl and drained the rest of his broth. And, What did you say to this? She asked, voice oddly thin. That it was ridiculous, of course. You'd think I'd notice if my own girlfriend was a Jinchuriki. He saw how stupid it was eventually, but then he decided he wanted you anyway so he could implant you with the two-tailed bijou. I told him he'd have to do it over my dead body. I'd sooner die than let them turn you into one of those things. Kushina swallowed visibly. That's sweet of you, she said, standing abruptly to whisk both their bowls over to the sink despite still not yet having finished her portion. Perhaps hearing of Kusunagi's strange plans for her had spooked her because she immediately changed the subject. Well, I don't know what you're doing but I need to go out and run some errands. Right now? He asked in confusion, glancing at his watch. It was a little late to run errands unless they were the kind of errands so nefarious they required the cover of darkness. Yes, she said with a stiffness that implied uncertainty. Although I guess you'll be going to bed. All that traveling must have worn you out. I suppose, but before you go can you help me make it? He beseeched. Since you stripped it and covered it with boxes and all. Kushina suddenly swore and slapped a hand to her forehead, something he didn't think he'd ever seen anyone do in reality except Kushina. I'm sorry. Of course, yes, I'll help you. What's that about anyway? He asked her cheerfully. When you wrote that you were turning my bedroom into a storage room I thought you were joking. I was, yes, she said distractedly, moving past him and out the door to climb the stairs. I was actually trying to make your room unlivable with my crap before you came back for the festival. Minato scrambled to the bottom of the stairs. Why? Were you trying to kick me out? Of your room, yes. She hesitated on the upstairs landing and braced her hands on the banister. Looking down at him without actually looking directly at him. I guess it was my stupid way of offering you my bed. How confusing. Minato frowned. Your bed? But then where would you sleep? After a long beat of silence Kushina's eyes rose to the ceiling and she shook her head in defeat. She moved on to his room to begin pulling the junk off his mattress. Downstairs, the penny dropped. Minato, realizing her true meaning, flew up the stairs faster than he had moved at any point during his fight with A. He stopped in the doorway of his own room and promptly began stammering like an idiot. That's fine. Your bed, I'll take it, sharing stuff is good for the environment, right? Don't bother moving your crap, it looks good there. Don't put a brave face on, Minato, Kushina said, kicking a box of old birthday cards across the floor. I know you're tired and all bashed up. You don't want to share right now with someone who snores and steals the covers. I can wait. Minato was really beginning to regret stopping the medic from healing his injuries. I'm not that tired, he insisted. And I like your snoring. Kushina ignored him. There, she said, clearing away the last box and dumping a load of folded sheets on the mattress. You can manage the rest, can't you? I really have to go do my errands now. Now? He repeated, even more incredulously than before. Right now? Yes. She tried to move past him, but Minato caught her by the wrist and pulled her close. Though she allowed him to cup her face in his hands he couldn't help but notice the reluctant roll of her eyes. It's my hair, isn't it? He said plaintively. You don't want me anymore. Minato, she exploded, shoving him angrily. Considering she normally laughed off his lame jokes, he knew he wasn't just imagining this funny mood swing. Then it's what we talked about, he guessed. I'm sorry if I brought up bad memories or thoughts. I shouldn't have said anything. That's not, she began awkwardly. I mean, I'm not, I don't care. Okay, he said quickly, seeing as how she was turning an alarming tomato color, either in badly suppressed anger or embarrassment. You just have some errands to run. I understand. She nodded pensively. Yes, exactly. Minato smiled and pressed a short kiss to her mouth, followed by a second much longer one when she didn't object. He tasted chicken ramen and an undeniable pout, and her hand spanned his ribs, not quite affectionately, more like someone measuring a joint of meat to see if she was getting her money's worth. Breaking the kiss, she scowled at him, but kept her comments on his weight to herself. "I missed you," he told her. It was a bit of an understatement. Although they had technically been dating for 2 years, the amount of time they had actually spent in each other's presence must have added up to a total of perhaps 1 month or 2. Letters had filled the void in their relationship, but they hadn't been a fulfilling substitute. Words and paper couldn't compare to the warmth of a body, or the sound of the softly lilting whirlpool accent. "I'm glad you're finally back, Minato," she said to the collar of his shirt. "Don't stay out too late, Kushina." Her hand pressed to his chest gratefully and then slid away as she moved past him. He doubted she had any actual errands, but something he'd mentioned had disturbed her and he recognized her need to escape. He guiltily listened to her footsteps receding down the stairs, and when he heard the front door pull close he turned to regard his unmade bed with consternation. Eventually he made the sheets lie flat and crawled in between them. The effort was enough that even if he hadn't been exhausted before, he certainly was now. With only a few fleeting thoughts for Kyumo and Iwa and Jinchuriki and Kushina and her bed, he closed his eyes and slept, unaware that his girlfriend had made it no further than the porch of their house and now sat on the steps staring up at the distant friendless moon with wet eyes and a growing unease in her heart. After the bell rung it was only a matter of seconds before the stampede of little feet belted out of the academy doors into the sunlit yard where their parents waited for them. Tattered art projects were presented triumphantly to approving coups and some magnificent injuries sustained during a typical day's training were shown off with equal pride. A lot of the children hung back, waiting to see an adult they belonged to before plunging into the crowd, while plenty more just scampered off into the streets, evidently belonging to no one. A long time ago, Minato would have been one of the latter, although it was hard imagining he had ever been that small and scrawny looking. Kushina would have said it was only last week. The larger groups of kids that passed him had a tendency to cease all conversation as they drew near and stare at him blankly as they shuffled by before bursting into animated chatter the moment they were comfortably out of reach. They were the shy ones. The bold ones simply ran right up to him, demanding to know what he was up to and if he would share the prized secret of his jutsu with them. The answer to that was always, "I'm only here for Hatake Kakashi." Parents and children dispersed and the schoolyard gradually emptied. A couple of kids remained standing around, waiting for parents who were unconscionably late. A scattered handful continued to trickle out through the doors, the ones who were slow to pack their bags and lace their shoes. One with dark hair and thick goggles ambled past blithely, late to leave and obviously not expecting anyone to meet him, which was odd for a child of the Uchiha clan. "Obito," Minato called out to the boy, making him jump. It wasn't like he'd been skulking in shadows trying to frighten unwitting children, but perhaps those goggles obscured his peripheral vision. "Madame?" The young boy stammered, unable to understand why a legend was addressing him. Minato didn't remember names well, but Obito had stuck out in his head for no reason he could think of, except that his bumbling and assertive self reminded him strongly of Kushina, and Minato was known to have an inexplicable fondness for idiots. "I haven't done anything." "Have you seen Kakashi around?" he asked the guilty-looking boy. "Kakashi?" Obito pulled a face as he hitched his backpack more securely over one shoulder. "Didn't see him leave the classroom. He's bragging to everyone that you're mentoring him. Is that true?" "Not yet," Minato told him honestly. Obito pumped the air with savage satisfaction. "I knew it, that Kakashi is such a liar." "So he's still in the classroom?" "Yeah, I don't know. Probably." With that ringing certainty, Minato gave up waiting around and headed inside the academy, giving Obito a pat on the head as he passed, who would then refuse to wash his hair for the next 3 weeks. Not much had changed about the interior of the academy since he'd last set foot there for the Chunin exams. The same walls still needed repainting, the teacher's lounge still stunk of coffee and cigarettes, and the coat hooks were still covered in decades of stickers and glitter and ink and anything else kids used to personalize their tiny bit of property. The only things that had really changed were the children's arts and crafts that covered the walls. Another generation, another art project. Minato walked past a wall that was now hidden under a collection of masterpieces denoting what the artists wanted to be when they grew up. The whole class apparently wanted to be the Hokage. Except that one kid who'd drawn some kind of man made of ice cream. Kakashi's classroom was 2B, though Minato didn't know that until he passed by the door and noticed the small figure within, whittling away at the surface of his desk with a compass. His back was to the door, so Minato took the opportunity to silently creep inside and up behind the boy. "Guess who?" he said, clapping his eyes over Kakashi's eyes. "Oh," said the boy, with all the gloominess an 8-year-old could muster. "It's you." That was unusually lackadaisical, even for Kakashi. "Don't tell me you're in detention." "No," was Kakashi's despondent reply. "I'm not in detention." "Then you're here because..." "I'm waiting for Dad to pick me up." "Ah." Minato sat down on the edge of one of the desks, hands deep in his pockets. "He's not back from his mission yet, Kakashi-kun," he reminded him. "That's why I'm picking you up." Again. "I'm not going to Mrs. Takahashi," Kakashi said staunchly, speaking of the neighbor who Minato usually dropped him off with. "Her house smells of flu. Dad was supposed to be back 3 days ago, and we were supposed to go training. You know how these missions sometimes run on, but he'll be back soon," Minato reassured him. "You can't stay here forever." "Can?" Kakashi hooked his feet around the legs of his chair in case Minato might try to bodily carry him away. "Why can't you look after me? Why do I have to go to her house?" "Because I have my own work to do." "What work? When are you going to start teaching me?" "When you're a little older. Anko already has one of the Sannin teaching her, and she's younger than I am. Would you like Orochimaru to mentor you?" Kakashi suddenly went very still and very white. "Well, there you go." Minato folded his arms. "It's up to your father anyway, and when he decides you're ready." With a sad sigh, Kakashi dropped his chin onto the desk. "I'm ready now," he whined. Minato took pity on him. "I know. I'll talk it over with your father when he gets back. If he ever gets back. Of course he will. And you'll forget." "I won't forget. And I can look after myself. I'm not a baby." "I bet your dad never forced you to be babysat at my age." "Well, no," Minato admitted, but didn't add that this was because his father never cared where he was or what he was up to. He'd had a spectacularly free childhood in that sense, and Jiraiya had always provided him with all the attention and affection one needed from a male role model. He had never considered himself a deprived child, and if he was neglected he'd never felt as if he'd suffered for it. But in retrospect he wouldn't have minded being babied to death if it meant having a father like Hatake Tsukumo who cared as deeply as he did. And who spoilt him rotten. "Wait. You don't know who your dad is, do you?" Kakashi asked. "How blunt. Who told you that?" "Kushina." "Except," he said, slowing down as his brain caught up with his mouth, "she said I probably shouldn't mention that to you." "Oops," Minato agreed with a soft laugh. "Don't worry about it. I won't tell her you mentioned it. I know your mom though. She was real pretty. You've seen my mother?" Minato asked uncertainly, because Kakashi was way too young to be viewing the kind of pinups she appeared in. "Yeah, she's right over there." Kakashi pointed a finger towards the back of the classroom. There was only the last row of desks and the wall behind them as far as Minato could tell, but Kakashi was quite insistent. He unshackled his feet from his chair and went to the back wall to clamber up onto the set of cabinets there and point out something pinned to the wall. Minato followed curiously. "Photos. Lots of photos, and most appeared to have resisted the fate most projects met when put up on a wall, which was to last perhaps 1 term or 2 before being dismantled into the recycling bin. Some of the photos were so old they were in black and white, and the one Kakashi was pointing to lay somewhere in the transition between sepia and full color. These are all the teams that graduated from this class, Kakashi explained to him. That's your mom, right? She looks just like you. Minato would have agreed, but at that moment he was struck speechless. He'd never seen a picture of his mother when she was a fresh genin, and the resemblance between this photo and Minato's own graduation picture taken at the same age was unmistakable, bordering on uncanny. From the cut of her hair that was only slightly longer than his had been, to her mild smile and off-center posture, Minato recognized her because he saw the same things in the mirror every day. No wonder people called him a pretty boy. You didn't know this was here? Asked Kakashi. No, but... Minato glanced around the room, a memory stirring in the back of his brain that he'd long ago put out of mind. Wasn't it Tsukumo who had told him he would find something in the academy, in one of the classrooms? Had he meant this one? He looked once more to his mother's graduation picture, gaze roving across the people standing with her, another boy and a girl, all 3 lined up before their Jonin teacher. The second girl was an Uchiha from the look of her, who bore a strong resemblance to what Mikoto would look like if she'd been born with the same aura of belligerence as someone like AI. The boy standing between the 2 girls looked as if all the picture's color had faded from his features, although he probably was just as pale as he looked. If Kushina had such problems with her fair skin that she needed an umbrella on the sunniest days, this guy probably slept in a coffin during daylight hours. Him and her don't get on, Kakashi continued, pointing at the bleached boy and the dark Uchiha. How'd you know? Minato couldn't imagine he'd deciphered such a thing from the picture. Even the ugliest of rivals could look like charming friends in that split second between the photographer shouting, "Smile," and the flash going off. As far as he could tell, this team looked no more or less closer than any other team on this wall. Dad told me. She's an Uchiha and he's a Senju. They didn't get on, like dogs and cats, always fighting. He was in the same graduating year as them, right, but I think he was in another class. I wonder what happened to them. He had occasionally entertained the thought that his mother had once had a team of close comrades who would maybe be able to tell him more about her than he'd ever learnt from his father. If he'd met either of these 2 before, they hadn't mentioned their relation to his mother, and he couldn't match their young faces to anyone he knew of. They're dead, Kakashi said matter-of-factly. Most of the people on the wall are dead according to our teacher. They were all his students, right, so he's outlived them all, and he says he's even going to outlive us probably. Cheery guy. Kakashi thought for a moment. Actually, I think he's quite sad. Yeah, I suppose you're right. Minato looked at the picture one last time, then smiled at Kakashi. Time to go, I think. No, objected Kakashi, though he didn't physically resist Minato helping him down off the cabinet. Minato shrugged helplessly. You want me to leave you here? The teachers will kick you out soon, then what? Then I'll go home. I can look after myself. Of all the stubborn little mules. You're only 8, Kakashikin, 8.5. Kakashi corrected. When I was 8.5 I always did what my elders told me to do, Minato said. He also went dumpster diving outside the community center quite a lot for toys, but the less said about that, the better. The point was he now realized how horrifically unhygienic and dangerous that was, and he knew better than to let another 8-year-old run free. But Mrs. Takahashi makes me eat stale biscuits and watch TV. You love TV. She only has 3 channels and you can't see what's going on. It's horrible, I just sit there for hours trying to breathe through my mouth. Minato had gone to war and faced more murderous opponents than he could count, and he'd faced them all without his resolve and confidence ever wavering. Now he looked into the beseeching little face of this little boy and found himself turning weak. No one liked stale biscuits and old people smell. 8-year-olds with all the energy of a young son had to find that kind of environment pretty stifling. "If I take you home," Minato began, "do you promise not to cause trouble, not to break anything, to go to bed on time, and not set fire to yourself at any point?" "Yes." Kakashi agreed passionately. "All right then. Get your bags." If Tsukumo ever found out about this, he would be dead. Kakashi was very agreeable after that, if not downright excited about the prospect of a night by himself. "Don't get too excited," Minato warned him as the kid virtually skipped down the pavement alongside him. "I'll make sure someone comes round to check on you. And if you're not in bed on time, yes, chortled Kakashi. It was a long walk back to the Hatake household, part of the reason Tsukumo had demanded that his son be accompanied. Kakashi was cheerful most of the way, but as they got to Mrs. Takahashi's house and Minato stopped to knock on the door and explain that there had been a change of plan, Kakashi hid behind her fence. But at the final furlong, as Kakashi's house came into view, it looked as if there would be another change of plan. Hatake Tsukumo was back. Minato's first gut reaction was relief. He wouldn't be accused of reckless endangerment if Kakashi would be with his father. However, he quickly realized all was not well. Tsukumo was standing out on the porch, perhaps only just back from his mission by the look of his clothes, and before him stood Kushina. She looked more furious and fiery than he'd ever seen her. Kakashi made to dash forward in delight, but Minato grabbed the back of his shirt to slow him. This didn't look like a good moment to trample through. "Just leave it alone, Kushina," he heard Tsukumo say as they neared cautiously. He sounded unusually tired. "I can't believe you." She stared at him, fists clenched. "This is shameful. There's nothing you can do. I'll give them a piece of my mind. That's the last thing I need." Kushina banged the flat of her palm against the house wall. "You can't just accept this, Sensei." Tsukumo shrugged heavily and turned, walking into the house without even the energy to slam the door in her face. Kushina didn't follow him. She stared glassily into space, breathing hard, and Minato knew her well enough to know this was a good time to evacuate the area. When Kushina looked like that, it usually meant she was about to blow and you didn't want to be in the blast radius when that happened. Suddenly she whirled and saw them. Both Minato and Kakashi jumped a little. Only one thought ran through Minato's mind. Oh. But though she saw them, it was as if she hadn't really seen them at all. Storming down the porch steps and into the street, she blew past them without once showing a flicker of recognition. Wherever she was going now, she was single-minded with determination, and Minato could only pity whoever had incurred her wrath today. With the tempest gone, Minato nudged Kakashi forward. "Come on," he said, "let's see your dad." He'd left the door wide open, and Minato knocked on it politely as he passed inside. "Sakimo-sensei," he called. Then he stopped. Tsukumo had only gotten a few feet into the house and now he was leaning against the wall in the hallway, back to the door. "Dad!" Kakashi ran forward to drag on his father's hand. "You didn't pick me up." Tsukumo took far too long to notice his son, Minato felt, and when he looked down at Kakashi it was with a strange blinking bemusement as if he'd forgotten who this child was. "Not now, son. What did you do to make Kushina so angry, Dad?" "Kakashi, go to your room." Kakashi reeled back as if he'd been smacked. Perhaps he'd never been told to go to his room before, or he just didn't understand what he'd done wrong. Minato didn't understand either for that matter. But, why? Just for a little bit. Tsukumo's voice lacked any kind of anger or reproach. It lacked pretty much anything else too. Kakashi glanced back at Minato with a conflicted expression that clearly said his planned evening had been ruined by his father's return and the funny mood he'd brought back with him. Minato raised an eyebrow. Perhaps he might have preferred the house that smelt like flue more? Kakashi's plodding footsteps retreated up the stairs and a moment later his bedroom door slammed shut with deliberate relish. "Is everything all right?" Minato asked. He'd never seen the other Jonin like this, and when Tsukumo's gaze wandered over to Minato and he smiled faintly, it was a peculiarly empty expression. "It's nothing. But perhaps you can do me a favor? Go after Kushina and stop her. Her heart's in the right place but she'll only make matters worse." This didn't sound like "nothing" to Minato. He searched Tsukumo's face for an answer, but all he saw was a bone-deep weariness that didn't suit him. "How was your mission?" he asked quietly. As the person who had uncovered the original intel, he was one of only a few who were privy to what Hatake Tsukumo had been up to for the last few weeks and just how vitally important his mission was. Sabotaging relations between Iwa and Kumo was no easy feat, and potentially the future of Konoha was at stake. There were not many missions where so much hung on the line, but if anyone could do it, it was Tsukumo, and when he stared at Minato with hollow eyes, a horrible twisting feeling began in Minato's gut. "I have to wash," Tsukumo said, gesturing to the old, brown blood splashed across his tunic. "Please excuse me." He turned and began to make his way up the stairs, not even appearing to notice Kakashi ducking out of sight behind a corner. Nothing about this felt right. Minato backed out the house quickly and set off in the same direction he'd seen Kushina leave in. Perhaps before he carried out Tsukumo's request to stop her he could ask her just what the hell was going on. He knew a failed mission when he saw one, he'd seen that fatigued and emotionally drained expression before, he'd felt it, certainly, but something more was going on here. Tracking Kushina led him towards the center of the town. It was easy to stop and ask people which way she'd gone. Everyone remembered the red-headed beauty, especially when she was in a temper. Minato didn't have to search particularly hard. It was only a matter of time before he spotted the gathering crowd at the base of the Hokage Tower and he headed towards it with a resigned sigh, that anxious twisting in his stomach becoming a fully fledged attack of knots. The crowd wasn't thick yet, but as he approached it more people were stopping to rubberneck, and Minato realized when he pushed his way, politely, through them to see what was going on. Kushina had, in typical fashion, picked a fight. Minato didn't know whether to be amused or horrified that she had picked an opponent twice her size backed up by 10 friends just as big or bigger. It had not come to blows, yet. Kushina didn't seem at all intimidated by the fact that she barely came up to his chin and had to crane her neck as she jabbed her finger accusingly at him. "You have no right," he heard her shouting. "You had no right to do that to him. You weren't even there," the other ninja shouted back, turning steadily red from either anger or embarrassment at the crowd they'd drawn. "I didn't have to be there. He's twice the man you are and 10 times the ninja. Compared to him you're a slug that even some academy brat could chew up and spit out without breaking a sweat. He saved your lives and this is how you repay him. You should be crawling to him for forgiveness. Instead you stab him in the back, you pathetic lowlifes." One had to admire just how naturally confrontation came to Kushina. She never lost her determination or focus, and the way insults rolled off her tongue made it look easy. In her hands, it was an art form. That was why Minato and dozens of others had stopped to mutely watch the exchange. "It's done." The ninja attempted to move around her but she always stepped sideways and blocked him whatever he tried to do. "You coward, you won't ever face me. You can sneak behind a man's back and destroy his career, but you can't look me in the eye. He's destroyed this village. We did what we had to, take that back. Take it back or I'll tear that tongue right out." Another member of the gang behind the first ninja cut her off. "Why don't you go back to your own shitty little village and leave Konoha matters to own people? You don't belong here anyway." Kushina threw herself into the mob, fingers flashing like claws in search of the speaker. "Why don't you come over here and say that, you freak?" She was jostled back easily with jeers. "Yeah, he's a real great man, sending a little girl to fight his battles for him, one of them remarked. There was an almighty crack and suddenly the speaker was falling back on the floor, blood pouring from a spit lip. Call me a little girl again and the next thing I split open is your skull. The original man she'd been arguing with reached for her, face twisted with fury. You, bitch! He caught her by the collar of her tunic and raised his fist. Enough! Minato cleaved between them, firmly pushing them apart as he headed for the fallen ninja to help him to his feet. I think you're missing a tooth, sir. Perhaps everyone can take a moment to have a look for it and watch they don't step on it. The riled gang of ninja were suddenly transformed into a bemused herd of men shuffling around with their eyes to the ground, looking for a lost tooth. The crowd that had gathered saw the confrontation was over and quickly lost interest, drifting on their way like they'd never been sidetracked. Only Kushina was immune to such deflection. Collar rumpled, she stood glaring at Minato's back, trembling with pent-up rage. Ah, here it is. Minato called cheerfully, picking up a bloody premolar. Handing it back to its owner he said, perhaps you should go to the hospital before you lose any more blood. No thanks to your girlfriend, he lisped sullenly. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before insulting Uzumaki Kushina? Minato's smile didn't waver, but something in his tone let the other ninja know Minato was definitely not on his side here. The gang dispersed, shooting filthy looks at Kushina who returned them all twice as fiercely. There were bloody marks on the knuckles of her right hand, and Minato reached for it to see if it was her blood or just that of the poor man she'd sucker punched. The second he touched her she jerked away, turning her glare on him. Don't you get me started. You shouldn't have interfered. I just saved you from a brawl, he pointed out. Why don't you calm down and, calm is the last thing I need right now. People need to see exactly what kind of cowards they are. I don't know. Minato scratched his head. To try and take you on when there's only 12 of them seems pretty brave to me. Before he could ask her just what it was they'd been arguing about, she turned and stalked away, heading for the entrance of the Hokage tower. Minato had a bad feeling about that. He quickly sped after her, but every attempt he made to slow her down she brushed off like he was nothing but a pesky fly. She marched up the flights of stairs without pause to the top floor and ignored the aide who leapt out from behind his desk at her appearance. The Hokage is in a meeting, he said to Kushina as she swept past him. You're not allowed to disturb bite me, she snarled, and Minato apologized in her wake. Stop her, Tsukumo had said. Minato might have had more success at stopping the flight of a cannonball with his soft, squishy body. He knew at this point he really should have retreated in order to dissociate himself from whatever hell was about to break loose, but on some level he knew that while Kushina was being irrational and crazy, his irrational and crazy girlfriend was right. He'd seen Tsukumo, and he'd seen the guilt on those men's faces. Now he wanted to know what the hell was going on. The Hokage didn't even look surprised when Kushina burst through the door like a focused tornado. Minato balked at the idea of crashing the Hokage's private meeting, but it looked as if Sarutobi had expected this. He dismissed his ANBU agents with a wave of the hand and looked at Minato. Shut the door, if you'd be so kind. Minato obeyed. He made sure he was on the inside of the office when the doors closed, however. He wasn't going to miss this. I can't believe what I'm hearing, Kushina began, her tone no different with the leader of Konoha than it had been with the pathetic lowlifes downstairs. You can't do this to him. Nothing has been decided yet, said the Hokage firmly. 40 years he's served your village and he makes one mistake. It was always a bad sign when Kushina abdicated citizenship of Konoha. Last time it had happened, she'd run away and put the village in a state of high alert. It's a mistake that may have cost us the war before it's even begun. The Hokage plucked off his hat and dropped it on his desk with a sigh. His head looked very different without it. The daimyo and his council are already demanding accountability and the dust hasn't even settled yet. Do you understand how dire this situation is, Kushina? Punishing sensei won't fix anything, she protested. No, But some very powerful people will be satisfied, he said heavily. And with the way things are, we may need to distance ourselves from him. Make it look as if he was acting alone. I can't be seen to do nothing. And he pays so you can save face? Nothing has been decided yet, the Hokage stressed once again. Hedged Minato, reminding the other occupants of this room that he was also there. Hokage-sama, I'm not sure I understand. Has Sakumo-sensei's mission failed? The Hokage laughed humorlessly. Failed? If only. It's been a complete disaster. What happened? Before he could explain, Kushina beat the Hokage to the draw. Sensei only went and saved the lives of everyone on his team. Where I come from, he'd be considered a hero, but apparently here people don't take kindly to that sort of thing. She glared at Minato like it was his fault. Am I wrong? Isn't this exactly what he's been decorated for at least 5 times? It's not that simple, Kushina, and you know it, the Hokage said shortly. Of course I understand your feelings, but this was not a mission that could risk failure. Sakumo, he saved his team directly at the cost of the mission. Honorable, yes, but so short-sighted. They all knew going into that mission that if necessary the mission came before their lives. Sakumo of all people should have remembered. He doesn't deserve to be stripped of his rank. Kushina exploded. It may not come to that, the Hokage admitted, but people are angry. He saved 12 lives but his actions may ultimately cost us hundreds. Even his team is upset. Yes, we saw, Minato said darkly. Yes, I saw too. The Hokage cast Kushina his special dirty hippie look. And I'll thank you not to pick fights in the street, young lady. If Minato hadn't interfered who knows what would have happened to you. Kushina folded her arms tightly. I can look after myself. That's beside the point. Have you forgotten everything Biwako taught you? The last thing I need is you losing control over this. He sighed and leant forward to consider the hat on his desk. Perhaps you should go home and cool off. Things will get better, I'm sure, once people realize it's not the end of the world. Sakumo will need you by his side in the coming days, however, more than I need you biting my head off. Her tongue clicked in annoyance, but her temper had cooled enough to perhaps realize she had been shouting at Hokage for the last few minutes. The Hokage had been awfully patient considering, but finally his hint for her to leave got through. Her bow was short and her apology was too terse to sound genuine. She stalked out and Minato moved to follow her, but the Hokage called him back. I wanted to talk to you, while I have the chance. Minato was 13 years old again, wondering if he was in trouble. Kushina looked as if she wondering the same thing, and she closed the door after her with a long suspicious look at him. I'm sorry about Kushina, Minato said to the Hokage once she had gone. She's a redhead. Quite. This seemed to explain everything. No, this isn't about her. I just thought it was prudent that you understand the details of Sakumo's mission, considering how involved you are already. Thank you, sir. Well, as you know the plan was to disrupt the bijou exchange between IWA and Kumo and sow some mistrust, if not outright break their alliance. Unfortunately, the Hokage heaved a deep sigh. As events have unfolded, the bijou exchange was successful. IWA and Kumo's alliance is stronger than ever, more so after our plot was discovered. How did it happen? Minato asked, frowning. It seems hard to believe Sakumo could do anything so bad to deserve what I'm hearing. Hatake Sakumo is one of our greatest fighters and strategists, anyone could have made that miscalculation certainly. Some of the information you gathered was out of date and the implantation of the bijou did not take place when and where they thought it would, and they arrived too late to stop it. So they decided to stage an attack on the IWA group as they traveled back to the Earth country and do so posing as Kumo Nin while simultaneously Sakumo was to infiltrate Kumo, posing as an IWA Nin, and attempt to steal their secrets of sealing bijou into people. It was an elegant plan. If they'd pulled it off, IWA would be accusing Kumo of betrayal, and Kumo would be accusing IWA of theft, and possibly we may have gained some valuable sealing techniques in the process. Minato thought Kumo could keep their techniques for turning people into monsters to themselves. Perhaps the Hokage only wanted those secrets for the value of knowledge for the sake of knowledge rather than because he wanted to use them. The village already faced enough threat from other villages without adding more volatile Jinchuriki to the mixture. It sounds like a good plan, he said to the Hokage. What went wrong with it? What went right? Retorted the older man. His team was only to engage in a skirmish with the IWA group as they transported their new Jinchuriki back to their village. They'd been led to believe it would remain dormant, but when they attacked the group, it awoke. Oh, said Minato. Tsukumo abandoned his position to aid them. By the time he got there, the Jinchuriki had killed half its own people and the remainder of Tsukumo's team was pinned. Tsukumo got them out, but IWA had followed him. Their cover was ruined and they had to flee. But that's not his fault, Minato insisted. No, but it's likely that if he'd stuck to the plan, IWA wouldn't have traced him and the Jinchuriki would have been lost to the wilds. His whole team would have been slaughtered by that creature, Minato pointed out, horrified. And perversely he would have been congratulated if he'd permitted it. He didn't have to tell the Hokage that it was wrong, he could see it sat unpleasantly in the old man's mouth. Between you and me, I would have done exactly the same thing in his position. But there's no denying what kind of trouble his failure has unleashed on this village. I'm sure his men will come around, but they lost some friends on this mission and they were prepared to lose themselves too. They're young. Too wrapped up in the nobility of martyrdom to appreciate what Tsukumo did for them. I hope he doesn't take it too hard, but, knowing Tsukumo, he has a habit of letting things get to him more than they ought. The Hokage lapsed into silence, staring across the room over Minato's shoulder, his thoughts shifting to another place that could have been too personal to share. Minato waited, and eventually his gaze shifted back to him. I would be grateful if you could cool Kushina down a little. Her passionate defense warms the heart, but it's not going to help her sensei. I understand. Although why anyone thought he was capable of controlling Kushina was beyond him. But then if the Hokage had told him to go stop a tsunami with his sword he would have answered the same way. As if reading his thoughts, the Hokage said, she listens to you. God knows no one else in this village has that privilege. And perhaps I too should have listened to you. Minato tilted his head uncertainly. Hokage-sama? I've been thinking about what you said about these abductions. I doubt it would do much to redeem ourselves in the eyes of our enemies at this point, but perhaps that's not important. We have a moral obligation to ourselves and to innocence. And sometimes, in my position, you get too caught up looking at the big picture that it becomes easy and convenient to ignore the quiet cries of those who need help the most. It usually means one has been in power too long. Hokage-sama, don't doubt too quickly, the Hokage interrupted, holding up his hand. What I'm trying to say is that an old man like myself needs a kick from an incorrigibly idealistic youth like yourself. And possibly what this village needs is just the same. If you catch my drift. I don't understand, Minato said honestly. Did he want Minato to kick him? I'll be frank, Minato. I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow we start seeing IWA and Kumo creeping across the border, and at times like this Konoha needs strong, secure leadership. If anything were to happen to me, my successor would need to be not only an inspirational warrior, but be able to unite the village behind him and reassure the people that he can do the job. Minato's palms tingled. I had planned on officially appointing my student, Orochimaru, as my replacement. The Hokage rubbed his fingers over his brow grimly. He's a brilliant young man, in many ways he puts you and I to shame with his genius, but I know he's hardly one to gather friends. If he were to become Hokage, he would divide loyalties, and I fear he is not the kind of man who would for a minute suggest we continue searching for a killer targeting our enemies. In fact, he fought so hard against the idea that I'm certain now he is not the man this village needs. And you think I am? Minato all but squeaked. I have no plans on expiring just yet, said the Hokage sternly, and you are still far too young for my liking, so I'll continue dodging my coffin until I think you're ready. In the meantime, you can busy yourself looking for this phantom you're so obsessed with. If you can catch him, I'll know you're the right choice. I'll considering possibly announcing you as my successor. Minato blinked. Oh. What did that even mean? Oh, the Hokage repeated. Is that all you have to say? I don't know what to say. How about, thank you, Hokage-sama. Thank you, Hokage-sama. I am honored, Hokage-sama. I am honored, Hokage-sama. I'll be leaving now, Hokage-sama. I'll be, yes. Minato flushed and bowed deeply. Thank you. I won't disappoint you. Sarutobi's smile was weak, but a miracle considering the sort of disasters that must have been weighing on him. I would be surprised if you did. Afterwards, Minato wandered the streets of Konoha in a state of shell shock. This was probably what some would call the most momentous occasion of his life, and he had no idea who to tell. Kushina was too worried about her sensei's tattered reputation that she probably wouldn't care if he'd been announced king of the world right now. Jiraiya would want to know, in fact he'd probably want to be the first to know, but the news would have to wait until he returned from his reconnaissance mission. The Hokage wouldn't take kindly to him shouting it from the rooftops, so Minato kept walking in aimless circles until his feelings on the matter were securely bottled up inside. He still wasn't sure if what he felt was joy or anxiety. He was definitely filled with a sudden nostalgia for the quiet simplicity of his old outpost, where his role as leader had consisted of organizing the roster, considering empty maps, and occasionally getting kidnapped. But if he'd wanted to become Hokage ever since he was a Chunin so as to bring an end to the endless wars and exact some control over his own fate, what was the problem? Well, there was still plenty of time to worry about it later. He was sure once the Hokage considering it he'd realize what a mistake it was, especially when word got out and everyone from school teachers to council elders would be balking and asking, "Are you mad? He's barely old enough to drink, let alone lead." Until then, Minato was just grateful that he'd been given a second chance to track down the abductor. Perhaps this time he would make a damn difference. And that was how he happened to find himself outside Orochimaru's lab that evening. The daylight was fading and the streets were emptying when he knocked on the door. It seemed to make sense to him that the first place to restart an investigation was to pick up where it had left off. Orochimaru was the one who had closed the case, and perhaps he'd found things out after it had been taken out of Minato's hands, even if he had come to the wrong conclusion. But the lab was dark and silent and no one was responding to Minato's knocks. Absently he tried the handle and was a little surprised that the door clicked open, unlocked. He debated for a moment whether he should just leave and try again tomorrow or invite himself inside in case. Orochimaru was simply too absorbed in an experiment to have heard the door. The latter was risky, but on the upside, maybe he could find what he needed and leave without having to face the creepy, effete vampire. A day in which Minato did not have to see that guy could only be described as a good day. With a covert scan of the street that probably made him look far more suspicious than he did already, Minato slipped inside. It was just as perturbing as the last time he'd been here, except Orochimaru seemed to have added to his collection of jared animal fetuses. Minato suppressed a shudder. He had to drag his gaze away deliberately. What he wanted was information, not nightmares. He scoped the lab, trying to ignore the bloodstains on the tables. Was he still dissecting monkeys? For science or for pleasure, and casting a slightly more inquisitive eye over a row of test tubes filled with earth and little seedlings in different stages of development. He had a bad feeling about the cage of chirruping guinea pigs. He doubted Orochimaru kept them because he thought they were cute. The end of the lab seemed like a more likely place to search. That was where a long countertop inundated with mounds of papers and binders lay beneath groaning shelves of references and books. Minato approached cautiously, feeling a little like he was back in Kusunagi's office. This was definitely harder though. Back then he had been looking for anything and everything he could get his hands on, while here he had something very specific in mind and no knowledge of Orochimaru's key to filing, if he had any sort of system. Not to mention Kusunagi's office had been defended by one lone exploding tag. One quick glance around Orochimaru's desks revealed all kinds of traps and wards. Some were basic. Minato recognized a faint line of pencil had been drawn across 4 sheets of overlapping paper. If one were to pick them up to read them without realizing, the line would be broken and presumably Orochimaru would know someone had been rifling through his research. Other traps were a little more sophisticated. He noticed a hidden ink jutsu embedded in the spines of the books above his head. He knew if he was to grab one of those it wouldn't matter if he put them all back in exactly the same place, they would leave permanent ink on his hands that would take weeks to fade. Someone who had gone to such paranoid lengths to protect his research had almost certainly memorized his workspace more than Minato could possibly guess. There were no traps on the journal lying open on an old box, but knowing Orochimaru he would be able to tell if Minato so much as touched a page. He leaned over and scanned the open page, mostly out of mild curiosity to see what his handwriting was like. All 5 test samples expired today. The venom of Jugo is potent, removing tissue leads to regeneration and age regression in the original subject, must obtain more test subjects. Genosplicing survival rate, still 0%, spontaneous hair loss in 7/10 subjects, need more guinea pigs. Creepy. Minato sighed, losing interest. He stepped back, confounded with the volume of documents presented to him. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, and despite the fact that he had basically broken into this lab, he was not so without honor that he was really going to go pawing through Orochimaru's privacy. He would have to come back tomorrow, and what was that noise? Minato went still, lifting his head to listen. A tap at the other end of the lab was slowly dripping into a sink, though he didn't think that was what he'd heard. The guinea pigs were rustling around on their newspaper, eating straw, but Minato had tuned out their noises for a while now. Something else had registered for a moment there, so quiet that he wondered if he'd imagined it. And if he was going to start having auditory hallucinations, where else would they start but in a lab full of dead animals? There it was again. Too faint to identify, but definitely real, even if he sensed it rather than heard it. He might have been wrong to assume the lab was empty, because he was almost certain the noises were coming from that door over there. Minato remembered the blood bank on the other side that Orochimaru had showed to him once. Was he in there now? Hello? Minato called with trepidation as he cracked open the door and peered in. He was met with the low, steady hum of a small room full of refrigerators, each one containing hundreds of bottles of blood. There was no room for anyone to hide here, and since he didn't see Orochimaru skulking around anywhere, he had to assume he was mistaken. Perhaps he'd heard one of the fridge motors ticking over or something. But now he was here, he couldn't resist the curiosity of seeking out the fridge labeled N1. The bottle of blood named Namikaze Midoriko was exactly where he'd last seen it, and Minato stood staring at it, wondering why this little vial commanded his attention so much when he'd gone through life ignoring every image of her. He had never been left doubting what she looked like. From the time he was old enough to read, he'd been assailed with images of past heroes, plenty of which included his own mother. Magazines, calendars, books, especially the retro bingo books, there wasn't a single picture of his mother that he hadn't had to share with the rest of the world, and perhaps that was why they'd never interested him. The photo Kakashi had shown him had caught him off guard. Here at least had been one image of his mother that hadn't been reprinted and exploited and copied into 100 different hands, showing her as the person she was and not what the village had made her. Likewise, this little sample of her blood was something real, a little piece of his mother that remained on Earth, and so vivid and red it could have been fresh, even if he knew perfectly well she'd died 20 years ago. And the rest of her was now just dry ash and bone. Hard to imagine she'd ever existed. And was it annoyance or sentimentality that he felt when he realized that a second bottle had been placed beside hers, this one labeled Namikaze Minato? He was debating whether or not to reach in and take it back. Orochimaru had clearly never upheld his promise to search for a paternal DNA match, when he froze once more. As a fine prickling tremor ran up the back of his neck, he knew for sure he wasn't imagining that noise. It was back, and closer, and if he didn't know any better he would have described it as a scream. He looked over his shoulder at the old rusted door at the far end of the room. Enormous bolts sealed it shut, the only part of the door that looked new and properly maintained. It looked like something straight out of a ship, designed to be watertight or even airtight, although what purpose it served here, Minato had no idea. He just knew that someone or something was trapped behind it, and it made his skin crawl. Curiosity was said to kill cats, but Minato felt he was a sufficiently swift enough cat to take the risk. He approached the door to investigate the locking mechanism and reached for the first bolt. A cold, white hand snapped over his. He jerked around to come face to face with the pale, lipless fury of an androgynous Sannin. "Oh, hello," Minato blurted in panic. "What are you doing here?" Orochimaru demanded, his voice as soft and icy as his skin looked. "You were not invited." "I was looking for you," Minato replied, horribly pinned. Orochimaru was still gripping his hand, and between him and the door there wasn't much room. "I heard a noise and thought you might be through here." The Sannin's eyes narrowed to near slits. "Evidently I was not." "Evidently," Minato agreed, eyes flicking sideways in search of an escape route. "So what's back there?" "Experiments." Orochimaru was close enough that his breath fanned across Minato's face, and it was as cold and strangely odorless as the rest of him. "That's where I keep the larger animals for testing, apes and the like. They're very dangerous and very sensitive to being disturbed. It would be a shame if you blundered in there by mistake and something awful happened to you." "Is that legal?" Minato wondered, not for the first time. "Oh, yes. Would you like to see them?" Another faint moaning shriek rose and fell, and Minato swallowed. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.